Hello. Welcome along to episode 194 of Adventures in Pop. It seems like only a minute or two since I was recording episode 193. It has actually been a day or two, but I'm back early because two reasons. One is I've now watched the second and third episodes of Boybands Forever, and that's going to form the meat of this episode. Quite a lot to get your teeth into, actually. There, it's quite interesting, and I wanted to get it out of the way kind of early because next week there is a new Goldhawk Foxes single coming out on Friday. Now, if you go back to the last episode, I think I started by saying, need to have a little catch up of current events. One of which was to mention to you the new Goldhawk Foxes single's coming out. And then I went all vague and I couldn't actually find the date of its release. And so I just mumbled a bit. So I am back to tell you, it's called Hate the Fact You're Loving It. It is out on Friday. So that will be something like the 29th of November. So it is real. So if you're sitting comfortably, I'll begin. Now, look, we talked about Take That and E17, who were basically the subject of episode 1 of this 3-part documentary. And as I say, I've now watched episodes 2 and 3. Okay, so I just want to kind of pull it all together for you. Now, if you're going to watch it, I will be careful not to do any plot spoilers, but I think if you're going to watch it, the chances are you know what happens in the stories of Five and Blue and Westlife and a few others as we go through. So it's going to be, I don't think I'm going to spoil the ending for you. Let's just say they all split up in the end. Okay, good. We got that out of the way. So episode 2 picks up the story of boy bands from about 1996 onwards, and episode 3 picks it up around the turn of the century, around 2001. Okay. Episode 2 focuses on 5, 911, and Damage, which is quite interesting. Episode 3 then talks a bit more about Blue and about Westlife. So I think one of the things that I have to say from the outset is, one of the questions I would want to ask the makers of this documentary is, why did they choose these particular boy bands? I mean, okay, of course they've got to talk about Take That. It'd be crazy not to. They've probably got to talk about one of the, the Irish boy bands, if not both, Boyzone and Westlife. Boyzone actually are invisible in this documentary. I don't know why. Westlife are featured, although rather briefly, because let me say straight away, there's not very much to say about Westlife, and we'll come on and talk a bit more about that as we go through. So, for those who remember the 90s and the early noughties, we know that the kind of the British boy band phenomenon came on the back of the American boy band phenomenon. So we're talking about, NSYNC and Boys to Men and, in particular, New Kids on the Block. I mean, they did really, really well in America and reasonably well in the rest of the world, although, what it basically said was there is room in this market for more boy bands and girl bands. And that raises another question. Boy bands forever. Okay, so we're talking about Take That and E17 and 5, 911, Damage, Blue, Westlife, etc. There are quite a lot of boy bands that, for whatever reason, have missed the cut. And I think they are also part of the story because we want to, if you want to get the whole story of that phenomenon of boy bands and girl bands, we kind of should be a bit more inclusive, really, and talk about some of the other ones. And particularly, it is important to talk about some of the other ones that didn't really do very well, because isn't that part of the story? But the other thing is, why boy bands and not just boy and girl bands? Because clearly we're leaving out Spice Girls, who were absolutely world-beating enormous, and everyone knows that. We're leaving out All Saints, Atomic Kitten, Bewitched. I mean, there are a few others of far less stature than than Spice Girls, and I would say All Saints, who I just had a bit of a thing for. I liked them. Even Girls Aloud. I mean, then we're obviously into the X Factor, kind of early noughties. We're into the TV program version of picking a boy band, girl band. But I can't really work out why the story would be any different if we included Spice Girls or All Saints, etc., in our story of the 90s in particular. Spice Girls emerged in what, 96, 97. It was around the time that the early version of Take That was splitting up. But the narrative of these stories tends to be exactly the same. And I did talk about this in the previous episode. The narrative tends to be group gets formed, they work behind the scenes to work out what their thing is, what their look is. They do some dance routines, they learn a few songs, and then when their music is eventually released, the story tends to be huge success immediately, catching them completely off guard. Quite a few years of extremely hard work with relentless pressure, and then it kind of implodes. And they normally implode by one person leaving and then the rest giving up. And that happened in Take That, in Spice Girls, in Five, in Westlife. I mean, that is quite a regular phenomenon. One of them can't bear it anymore, walks out or has a breakdown of some kind, leaves, and then the magic is gone. Okay, but my question remains: why not talk about Spice Girls, All Saints, and the rest of them? Because essentially there is no difference that I can think of between these boy bands and those girl bands, and the story is the same. They are put together. They're just as contrived, those girls bands, as the boy bands always were. So I can't see why leaving them out is useful. So some questions there. The other thing is, it is the same story over and over, and therefore the telling of the story needs to be interesting. And I think the telling of the story, as I said for the first episode, I described it as linear, and it doesn't really improve as we go along. There are just these gaps that are unexplained, and then I think it's rather dependent on who the documentary maker was able to get hold of. That probably is one of the things that makes a difference in whether they get featured or don't get featured. So that's interesting. So if we just take them in order a little bit, what do we learn? Okay, Five, who were formed in the latish 90s. Five were there, managed by Simon Cowell. They were there to be bad boys. If Take That were the good boys who always went home and did their homework, and they were polite, to your parents. And if you went out with one of Take That, your parents would be delighted. Five were really aiming to be bad boys, And if you think about the late 90s, this is the period of the lad mag, and here were five lads. They weren't even boys; they were lads, and it all they signed contracts. They got famous incredibly fast, and their first album got number one. They had big hits. They won Best Band at the Brits in, I think, about 1990. And as the name suggests, there were five of them. And the thing about Five is that they come across now as five very individual people who had no particular camaraderie between them. They did get forced to kind of live in a house together, but I think that was trying to create some camaraderie that there wasn't. They were just five complete strangers thrown together to be five bad boys, and they were quite bad, and they did a bit of smashing things up and having fights. But in a way, they kind of think now that maybe they were playing up to the image that they thought that people wanted from them. So they were being as bad as they possibly could be because they thought that's kind of what we're supposed to be, isn't it? And one of them says, as the band gets bigger, the demand gets bigger and the pressure gets bigger. And it did. They got very big, and it got very difficult for them, I think. And certainly they were not expecting the level of fame and success they got, which was instant. One of the things that comes across very clearly is that one member of Five was desperate to leave because, and actually, when he looks back on it, the thing that's interesting is that he says, if they'd just allowed me a break, that would have been enough and we could have carried on. But because it was so kind of intransigent, it was just we have to go to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And in this kind of relentless way that goes on for years and years and is going to carry on as long as they put up with it. I think there's a point with each of these bands where they realise, particularly with Five and probably with Blue and with Westlife, they realise that the band has become bigger than the manager or the management or the concept in the first place, and that they do have some actual power to decide for themselves whether this is all going to be okay or not okay. And it's when they realise that they have power and that they can stop this juggernaut if they want to. That's normally the time the whole thing comes crashing down. It takes a few years to get to that point, but there is a sense, I think, that all of these boy bands have it built in from the beginning that the workload and the intensity is basically unsustainable. And in fact, they don't expect it to be sustainable because, like all these things, they're expecting the fame and the success to be transient, to be huge and brief, if that makes sense. Big and short, if that makes sense to you. And that's kind of how it is. That's how it plays out. And it's, again, as I say, it's that same kind of rhythm that kind of goes through each one of the stories here. So Five were the bad boys. Then there was 911. Let me just say about 911. I don't remember anything about them. They never made much of an impression on me. They were the good boys. They had no record company backing. They were doing it all on a complete shoestring. It took them longer to really make it. Eventually, they did have a number one hit in 1999 with A Little Bit More, which is that really insipid Doctor Hook song. I don't remember them covering it, but they did apparently. And even when they were struggling in this country to get anywhere, in Asia, in Malaysia in particular, they became absolutely huge. And to this day, I think are remembered very fondly by millions of Malaysians. Well done, 911. Then we talk about Damage. Now, Damage were a black band from London, and they were doing R&B. And in a way, they were closest to the kind of roots of where these boy bands came from, because the American boy bands were very much kind of R&B pop creations, worth just remembering. So Damage, they were the R&B, London boy band, and they did eventually have some success, but I would say they hit a wall of racism, basically, in the industry and possibly in the country as well, but definitely in the industry, where I think they realised, and there was not an awful lot they could do about it, that you had to be both white and straight if you wanted to be, successful as a boy band. And that was the expectation, white and straight. I suspect they were all straight. I don't think any of them were white. Their first single got to number 90, whereas, the others were having singles go straight into the top 10, top 5. Smash Hits wouldn't put them on the cover because, a black band won't sell Smash Hits magazines. That's shameful, actually, isn't it, when you think about it? I guess nobody would have particularly batted an eyelid in the late 90s that was the case, but you look back on that and that's pretty appalling. You wonder how much in the industry has changed from then to now. I don't know. I really don't know, but I guess not enough. So those 5911 Damage were the kind of the focus of of episode 2, and in episode 3 it went on to being mostly about Blue and Westlife. And as I say, Westlife, yeah, okay, there's the kind of the story about of Brian McFadden marrying Kerry from Atomic Kitten and leaving the band, and which is the story of, as I say, so many of the other bands as well. But it's interesting because actually Blue come across as a much more interesting story than Westlife. Westlife, they do acknowledge the fact that because nobody in Westlife could dance, and dancing was one of the important prerequisites of probably all of the other boy bands I can think of, but in Westlife, none of them could dance. Boyzone, none of them could dance. So Westlife, as you will remember, and it's the only thing I remember about Westlife is that they would have to have lots and lots of key changes in their songs, and the key change meant that you got your ass up off your stool and you stood up. That was it. It's not really enough, is it? Anyway, so let's talk about Blue. Blue are more interesting. I think it's Duncan from Blue who is being interviewed quite a lot in this, and he comes across as a bit patronising and but kind of sweet. And he says, as far as he knew, every boy band had to have one gay member. So I know I just said before, the expectation was straight and white. He's saying, yeah, but under the surface, what we would find out is every boy band had one gay member. Well, I'm not sure about that. Take That did it? Don't think so. Yes, Westlife and Boyzone had their requisite one gay member. In Boyzone, we know with Stephen Gately that ended really badly, and that was actually really sad. But we don't hear about Boyzone in this series at all. And Duncan, bless him, says that when Blue was formed, he thought it must be Lee from Blue who was the gay one. No, Lee actually just turned out to be the idiot, and the gay one turned out to be Duncan himself. And he says he had no idea until a bit later on, and then he had a relationship with some guy, and realised maybe. So it's kind of sweet of him to be that honest and open. The other thing about Blue is you will remember that they included Simon Webb, who was a black guy. So they had 3 white guys and a black guy. And they consciously recruited a black member because they were doing kind of, R&B type pop, and felt that it was necessary to make sure that there was at least, one black guy in the lineup. And it took a while to kind of agree that he was the one, but, he turned out to be one of the really good members of Blue. And the other thing is that over the years, Blue have kind of stayed together, and part of that is nothing to do with the record company. It's just that those 4 boys from Blue, even Lee, who I think is still the idiot, they were loyal to each other. They actually were prepared to kind of look after each other when the story of almost every other boy band is that there was nobody really taking care of them. Well, there was nobody probably taking care of Blue, but it seems as though, to their great credit, Blue were taking care of Blue. And I think that probably marks them out as a bit different from the others. I'm not a Blue fan. I never bought any of their music. I did buy one Simon Webb song when it was later than Blue. I can't even remember, but it was called Don't Worry, something like that. It's very good. I really liked it. And I think they are still possibly even going around doing the nostalgia trip today, performing every now and again, and they stayed together because they liked each other. They were prepared to look after each other when nobody else would. So well done, Blue. So look, that's where I'm going to leave it. Lots of questions about the way this got put together. I don't think it's perfect in any sense. I think here and there it did lapse into boredom. I think it did depend a little bit too much on who they could get to interview. And I sort of think that the job of putting into context boy bands and, dare I say, girl bands as well, hasn't really been fixed by this documentary. And so, fun as it was over 3 parts, I wouldn't say it's essential, and I think lots of questions remain unanswered. Thank you very much indeed. I'll be back to talk about a new Goldhawk Foxes single, as I mentioned, in the next few days. So you have a lovely end of weekend, beginning of the week, and I will talk to you soon. Bye-bye.